When Cyrus encamped before Babylon, whose inhabitants had made every preparation for a long siege, and regarded their city as impregnable, he realized the impossibility of taking it by storm, and decided to turn the course of the river into the lake, or swamp. What he did was to dam the river near where it entered and left the city, then cut trenches off the river to a huge trench he caused to be dug along the circumvallation of the city, and thus drew off the surplus waters. When all was prepared, he sent troops to break down the dam or gates of the canal, which released the surplus waters from the river into the lake, all being done under the cover of darkness, when the Babylonians were holding a religious revel and neglecting the guard. The river was then drained sufficiently to enable his soldiers to enter through the heavy brass gates, which in at least 2 places had been carelessly or deliberately left unlocked. These gates or locks were, it appears, built in tunnels which penetrated the surrounding walls. But there is no reason to believe betrayal was at work over this easy conquest, for Cyrus risked losing the flower of his army had his ruse been detected. No ancient city was ever more eulogized, or its grandeur and the height of its walls. Its glory was essentially owed to the king Nebuchadnezzar, and to his father, Nabopolassar, who had defeated the surrounding nations, and after the downfall of Nineveh, made it the world's capital, a center of great trade, enterprise, and wealth. Classic writers describe a city forming an immense square, traversed by 25 streets intersecting one another, which resulted in numerous smaller squares, not unlike a modern American city, and it might be averred, like the indications of the lost city's criss-cross streets traceable in Caithness. The principal thoroughfares terminated in a series of brass gates of prodigious strength, thickness, over which towered the immense walls, and outside the walls was a deep moat or a ditch, except where the river flowed. The estimated height of the original walls varies greatly. Herodotus made them 337 feet high and 84 feet wide, Ctesias and Oranius 300 feet, and Diodorus 75 feet. After Darius, Hystaspas lowered them, some accounts say to 50 feet. Diodorus says also that 6 chariots could ride abreast on their summit, though Herodotus states only 1, but he includes houses on either side. Their extent also differs from a circumference of from 40 to 60 miles, but Quintus Curtius, in his History of Alexander, said that only 90 stadia, about 11 miles, were occupied with buildings in rows, and that a great space stood apart and grew produce, etc. Nebuchadnezzar's outstanding works were the temple or Tower of Bel and the new palace. The latter was erected by him on the west of the river. Cyrus and later Alexander occupied this palace, and there the great Macedonian died of pneumonia contracted from a chill. The famous hanging gardens were laid out in the parks of this palace, consisting of artificial mounds with a succession of terraces, with a variety of trees which were planted to please his queen, Amytis, a Median princess, who came from a mountainous country, thus contrasting with the flat plain where Babylon stood. On the east of the river, exactly opposite, we are told, stood the old palace in the original city, adjoining which Nebuchadnezzar built a bridge, where here crossed the river to the new palace and city, so that at either end of it was one or the other of the palaces surrounded with immense walls. Is it a coincidence that the site of these two palaces is exactly duplicated at York by the old Bale in the west of the Ouse, whose origin is unknown to antiquarians, and the original palace facing it? In ancient deeds, the former is referred to as Vitas Balaim, or Balium, or Balia, signifying a place of security. Sheehan and Welland in their work on York describe it nearly a century ago as ornamented with a small plantation of trees, and from its summit is a fine view of York. The general view of this artificial tumulus in the time of the Saxons and that of William the Conqueror to serve as the chief garrison in that part of the city, not lying on the same side as the other castle. Naturally, historians and others have taken a very different angle to that presented here. They would no more have associated the old Bale with Nebuchadnezzar's new palace than with Timbuktu, yet we, pursuing a different clue, have here an artificial tumulus, a mound ornamented with trees, indeed a queer coincidence were it not the site of the hanging gardens, comparing exactly, it might be said, in the situation with the original palace across the river which the king of Babylon built for his queen. As regards the other castle on the east side of the Ouse, Sheehan and Welland mention that it was believed by Drake, the earlier historian of York, to have been erected by the Conqueror on the site of an earlier fortress. It was entirely surrounded by a deep moat, accessible only by two drawbridges. The principal gate was formerly on the east side, near the castle mills, and a small archway under the walls of the gate marked the spot where the ancient drawbridge was erected. In Leyland's time, Henry VIII, it was in a ruinous state, he writes. There be 5 ruinous towers within it. One further point by these two writers may be mentioned. Within the wall of the castle, they say, stands the beautiful ruin called Clifford's Tower. It stands on a lofty mound of earth which, at some remote period, has been thrown up by immense labour. The tumult and ruin exactly correspond with the old Bale Hill on the opposite side of the river. Drake thinks that a tower stood on the mound during the Roman residence. There is something about Clifford's Tower possibly of great interest, to which I will revert a little later. Let us first examine the evidence about the famous Tower of Babel. In proximity to the original old palace of Nebuchadnezzar stood the Temple of Bel, erected before his time, but which he very nearly, if not completely, rebuilt, increased and heightened, as well as enriched, early in his reign. This immense edifice captivated the imagination of the ancients. Constructed of brick and slime, tar, it rose from the ground in 8 portions or floors, like one tower superimposed on another. Ascent to its summit was by an outside staircase, a spiral staircase, with a resting place provided with seats at each flight. In the various compartments or stories were rooms with arched roofs, supported by pillars, which were related to the worship of the god. The topmost edifice was most sacred, expressly dedicated to the god Bel, furnished with a couch and a table, both of solid gold, but having no statue of the god, who was believed to occupy it at his pleasure. The wealth of this temple in statues, censers, cups, and other sacred vessels, all of solid gold and massive size, was almost fabulous. One golden image alone, 40 feet in height, weighed 1,000 Babylonian talents, according to Roland, the French historian. When Xerxes plundered the temple of its immense wealth, its value was over 21 million sterling. According to Diodorus, the upper part was an observatory, the Chaldeans being most famed beyond all others for their skill in astronomy. When Alexander the Great took Babylon, Callisthenes, the philosopher, discovered that they had recorded astronomical observations going back 1,903 years from that time. The construction of this vast edifice had two definitive purposes. One was astronomical, especially to watch Helios, Sirius. The other as a place of refuge in the event of another flood. Helios, or Sirius, otherwise Bel or Belin, was the Hyperborean Apollo, traditionally born in Delos, and was of the most vital importance in the eyes of the classical world, as the true habitation of the deity himself. Sirius, the star of Hermes, the god of astronomers, was always regarded with anxiety as the harbinger of drought, pestilence, wars, and celestial visitations, comets and meteors. The Hyperboreans, or Chaldeans, the same, related Sirius to the cause of the great catastrophe, and deified it as Apollo. How would this, it may be reasonably asked, have affected the religion and the astronomy of the ancients dwelling in the Persian Gulf, where no such catastrophe ever occurred, or traces could be distinguished? In Britain it was entirely a different matter. The great catastrophe destroyed Ur of the Chaldees, and it would seem that naturally Babylon, with Borsippa, the centre of Chaldean influence after Ur, would succeed as the seat of the Chaldean hierarch. This would explain the king's claim to be the Chaldean Hermes, the supporter of the god Apollo. He reconstructed the Temple of Bel based on astronomy, some 110 years after the malign event. He then being regarded, it would appear, as the living Hermes, messenger of the gods, chief of the Magi, in which capacity set up his famous image of Bel in the plain of Dura. It implied his image as God-King. That the temple was in essence astronomical, whereby from which its summit the star Sirius was observed closely in all phases and quadratures, was fully recognized. Sirius, as Bel or Belin, was carefully watched at Stonehenge and elsewhere in Britain, and when we consider the tradition that the tower was first erected after the flood in case God should be minded to destroy the world again, the basic principle resembles the Great Pyramid, raised, despite all the learned claims to the contrary, for the like purpose, although of totally different design, namely to preserve the sacred caste of Druids or priests in the event of another flood. The wise men of old, and Nebo, was the god of wisdom. Magi, astronomers, and rulers thus endeavoured to arrange for their self-preservation in this high tower in the event of another like catastrophe, for the water would have to mount very high to drown them, whereby they anxiously scanned the skies and watched Sirius. Owing to the wisdom of these ancient Chaldean astronomers, we have the prehistoric sacred engraved zodiacal signs, with the portentous message in Caledonia, including especially the Golspie stones, which contains in it celestial symbols, the information of when, how, and where the flood occurred in the time of Noah. And that is from Appendix B.